And welcome to Georgetown and to Riggs Library for another event in the Faith and Culture series. I'm Paul Elie, author and senior fellow in the Berkley Center and the moderator of the series. And this time, it's a first time we've had a Faith and Culture event tied in with Jesuit Heritage Week. So with that in mind, I'm going to invite Mark Bosco, the Jesuit and Director of Campus Ministry here at Georgetown, to say a few words about Jesuit Heritage Week and how this event fits in. Thank you, Mark.
The Jesuit. Thank you very much, Paul, and it's very nice to meet you, Larry. Obviously, welcome to another event at Jesuit Heritage Week, and it is a nice way to collaborate. One of the things that we want to suggest this day and all of our time here at Georgetown is that to be part of this heritage, it's not just about certainly just about Jesuits, but it's about an intellectual and an artistic heritage. And so we were looking for ways in which we could collaborate to see how the imagination is formed in our time together as educators, as students, in our institutions. And so when Paul came forward and says, well, we have a Detroit Jesuit high school, poet, I thought, that would be a great connection. And not only is he a great poet, but it's wonderful that we can think about the fact that this poetry kind of comes out of and is shaped in an imagination from a faith that is deeply rooted in our Jesuit values. So thank you very much.
Now to our guest, Lawrence Joseph. Larry, it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you here to Georgetown. I saw you the other day and said, well, we've been having a running conversation for 20 years, and you paused for half a second and then corrected me and said, 24. So for 24 years, you and I have been talking about poetry, literature, Jesuits, religious faith, New York, other writers, the publisher that we share, and how all those things fit together. And so it's a special honor to welcome you to Riggs and to pick up that conversation in this context. I'm so lucky to have the opportunity to lead these conversations at Georgetown, and you've been in mind really from the beginning as someone that I hope to have right here doing what we're about to do right now. I think on top of that, it occurred to me this morning, I've read everything you've written, more or less, and you've read most of what I've written, and there aren't too many writers about whom I can say that we have a relationship that's not just talk or work, but it's rooted in the writing that we've produced and our mutual appreciation. So thank you so much for all you've done for my work over the years, and I've gotten more than I've given, I can tell you that, and I'm so grateful for that. So welcome to Georgetown, welcome to Washington, the city of Imperium. And a little bit about you, things that I know, and many people here know, but others may not. Your grandparents, Lebanese and Syrian Catholics, were among the first Arab immigrants to the United States. You were born in Detroit, educated at UD High, the University of Michigan, Cambridge, and the University of Michigan Law School. You're the author of 6 books of poetry, the current book, So Where Are We?, 2 books of prose, Lawyerland and The Game Changed. Among your awards are fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. You're the Tinley Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law. You've taught creative writing at Princeton. You're married to the painter Nancy Van Gotham, who's here today, as are a number of other members of your family. And you live, as I do, in New York City. About your work, John Ashbery, who we lost not so long ago, said that it's poetry of great dignity, grace, and unrelenting persuasiveness. Lawrence Joseph gives us new hope for the resourcefulness of humanity and of poetry. A few weeks ago, the poetry critic for the New York Times, David Orr, cited the current book as among the 10 best books of poetry of 2017 as follows. Joseph writes restless, scouring lines that often take, and that's, what a word, scouring lines that often take aim at the cable news hothouse that so captivates our president. One title, In a Post-Bubble Credit Collapse Environment. He's one of our most acute poetic chroniclers of violence from the terror felt, violence in the suffering, violence in the mind, collectively modified, escalated to maximum speed. And I thought that couldn't be topped, but then came this review in the TLS. Lawrence Joseph's new collection of poems appears in a post-bubble credit collapse environment, namely ours. These are poems woven from the competing, maddening registers which pervade and overstimulate the urban West, alert to and engage with hyperconnectivity, the people and violence, there's that word again, of the contemporary United States. Joseph's is an angry, incisive voice brought to bear on the overwhelming surfeit of capital, technology, and power. For better or worse, these poems sound like where we are. A couple of extraordinary reviews, and very perceptive in that not only do they say how good the work is, but they say it in a way that I think honors the work. So I'm so glad that you're here today. It's our tradition in these events involving poets that we begin with poetry. So will you read something?
Thank you, Paul. It's a real privilege to be here. And our friendship for 24 years, I wrote a piece, an essay. Paul did his first, I think it was your first anthology.
Yes.
And it was an anthology dealing with the saints. And we had met through our, who Paul was then his assistant editor, Jonathan Galassi, who was my editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. He insisted when you told him you were Catholic, that he meet me, if I recall. And then you asked.
The boss said that we had to.
Yeah, the boss said that he had to meet, so he had to meet me. And then Paul asked me to be in that anthology. And we had to pick a saint, and I picked St. Lawrence, but I really wrote about the communion of saints. And it was shortly after my mother had died, and I hadn't really written an essay like this, and so it was a very important piece for me. And it was
More
a
than
way.
I could have understood at the time.
Well, it maybe more than even I could have understood at the time. But, and as Paul said, we've shared our work with one another. Paul was the sort of online editor for my prose book, Lawyerland. And we know one another's work extremely well. And so it's one of the great friendships of my life. And I'm just really feel privileged to be at Georgetown, one of the great universities in the world. And it's Jesuit, the Jesuit side of it, of course, extremely important to me, and we'll be talking about that. I'd like to read the title poem from my most recent book, So Where Are We? The poem begins with a reference to 9/11. And my wife and I, Nancy, live very close to Ground Zero. And my prior book, to So Where Are We? Into It, deals directly with the suicide bombing of the World Trade Center. So where are we? So where were we? The fiery avalanche headed right at us, falling, flailing bodies in midair, the neighborhood under thick gray powder on every screen. I don't know where you are. I don't know what I'm going to do, I heard a man say. The man who had spoken was myself. What year? Which Southwest Asian war? Smoke from infants' brains on fire from the phosphorus hours after they're killed. Killers reveling in the horror. The more obscene, the better. The point at which 100,000 massacred is just a detail. Acid and credit bubbles about to burst. Too much consciousness of too much at once. A tangle of tenses and parallel thoughts. A series of feelings overlapping a sudden sensation felt and known. Those chains of small facts repeated endlessly in the depths of silent time. So where are we? My ear turns like an animal's. I listen. Like it or not, a digital you is out there. Half of that city's buildings aren't there. Who was there when something was, and a witness to it? The rich boy general conducts the Pakistani heroin trade on a satellite phone from his cave. On the top floor of the Federal Reserve, in an office looking onto Liberty at the South Tower's one-time space. The Secretary of the Treasury concedes they got killed in terms of perceptions. 10 blocks away, the Church of the Transfiguration. In the back, a Byzantine Madonna. There's a God who fits the drama in a very particular sense. What you said, the memory of a remembered memory, the color of a memory, violet and black. The lunar eclipse on the winter solstice, the moon a red and black and copper hue. The streets, the harbor, the light, the sky. The blue and cloudless, intense and blue morning sky. I mean, the whole book is where we are. So, I mean, I don't want to just, it's not this poem. I mean, it's,
Well, that's one of the things that's always struck me about your work. You have, each of your titles is an Ars Poetica in miniature. It's a suggestion of what you're trying to do or what poetry can do. Shouting at no one, curriculum vitae, before our eyes, into it. So where are we? Each of those is encapsulates what's going on in the work. This effort to ask, so are we, in the current book, the effort to go into it in the book prior, the effort to kind of see and do justice to what's before our eyes in that book. That's the first book of yours that I knew because it had just been published when I joined FSG, and again, more than I could have known, so much was revealed, even in the jacket of the book. It's a beautiful book which has on its jacket the image of Ethiopian Christians from which century? Staring out with very large eyes, and the idea that before our eyes is the act of a poet, but also a kind of religious act of seeing or witnessing was very strong even before I opened the book. And as far as I'm concerned, you're doing it. And then in that essay that I invited you to take part in, and you wrote about the communion of saints, yes, it's about the communion of saints, and it's about your Catholic childhood, more on that in a moment, but it's about these two saints, Lawrence, your namesake saint, who burned on the gridiron, and as you say...
Turn me over, I'm done on this side.
Which is a certain kind of morbid Catholic imagination finds this...
Reported to have said.
But then there's that other saint of fire.
It appealed to me when I was a child quite
I
a bit.
bet it did.
My imagination.
That's what I want to know. I mean, you have then in that essay also this other saint of fire, Ignatius of Loyola, very part and part of this puzzle, you say, for whom God is revealed in what we sense, alive in the mind, seen through memory by the most disciplined will. I just went down to Woodstock and looked at the book, and that's a passage from that essay. These two saints of fire, early influences, and then there's fire in the poem you just read, and the fire of violence really running all through your work. Where does that start? Can you help us put that puzzle together?
The fire from St. Ignatius, on the fire, I think it goes into the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, that when I'm dealing with an imaginative fire, it would be...
Tongues of fire.
Yeah, tongues of fire. I actually have an image in a poem with the tongues of fire. And that comes from that whole language of my childhood, which was just very strongly affected by... we would go to Mass every day, and we had the missals we had were St. Joseph's missals, and the Mass would be in Latin on one side and English on the other. I started doing this when we were 6 years old, and then they would have litanies in the back, and then every day the saint, and a little picture and a little description of the saint. And so you start reading at 6, 7, and you start getting bored at Mass, and then you start reading this, and so I started reading that, and so very much that language, a liturgical language, and then in terms of my background, I come from a background of fiercely Catholic Eastern Rite Catholics. I'm baptized a Maronite Catholic, but I had a grandfather who was a Melkite Catholic, and these are Eastern Rites. But we grew up, it's part of the Roman Catholic Church, and we grew up in very strongly, and as my mother and father did, with parochial schools in Detroit, and then went to the Jesuit high school, which was a real significant change in the development of my family. My parents didn't go to college. They were educated at Catholic grade schools and high schools. They were born in Detroit. And we were the first generation to go to college. And one of my cousins first went to UD High, and then followed by my brother, and then my cousin, another cousin, and I. And then later another cousin, a brother and a cousin, and even children now are sons of other cousins. And so there's a whole side of us, of our family, in an extended sense, very tied into the Jesuit education, and it transformed every one of us, just in fundamental ways. The fire in the streets was experienced, and I'm from Detroit, and the direct experience with my father and my uncle had a store, a liquor store, in probably what was at that point the sort of most violent part of Detroit, and it was looted and burned in the '67 insurrection. And so I saw fire in the streets. I mean, so it was literal. This was not a kind of, it was really witnessed. And
You saw the place burn?
no, it had been burned and looted. And then there was a whole, for the first night of the insurrection. And I was there with my cousins, and my dad and my uncle, and then we left, and then it was later burned even further. But I mean, the city was on fire. I mean, this was the night. It was totally out of control, and so we were driving back from the store on Woodward Avenue, and we saw stores being, looted and being burned, and. Recently, there's been this movie, Detroit, about the Algiers motel. We drove by the Algiers motel the first night. Later, that became something. But the rioting and the looting and the burning, we were there right when it was out of control. And then that's just part of this. It's a part, the Detroit side is extremely important because that's where my grandparents went, and the Arab community in Detroit is significant. It's the largest population of persons from the Arab Peninsula, outside of the Arab Peninsula, are in Detroit and have been. And my grandparents were among the first immigrants from Lebanon and Syria, Catholics, to Detroit. And so I have a whole extended family in the Detroit area, and we're now all throughout the entire country.
What was it like? So some of your experience of Mass was an American Catholic liturgy, and then you would go to this Melkite church on a Sunday?
No,
or?
we would go to the Melkite. When we were younger, I was among the first grandchildren. I was born in the late 40s. My eldest cousin was born in 1945. And we were little, and my parents were young. We would go primarily on Palm Sunday and Easter. And we would go, Palm Sunday was an extremely important feast in the Eastern churches. And we would go then, and we would be part of the processions and everything. And then we would alternate churches. They weren't far away, and they were downtown Detroit. Then they're no longer there. They're out in the suburbs now. But they had histories. And so we would go there. And then when there were weddings, we would go. The weddings would be in the church. And early on, baptisms.
What language was the liturgy in?
I'm not sure. The Melkite, I think, was in Greek because it means Orthodox. And it was an Orthodox church, an independent Orthodox church that became Catholic, and so Melkite means Orthodox, and so the liturgy was almost identical to Greek Orthodox liturgy. And so, and it had a very, very strong iconic side and Byzantine side. And the Maronite, it does not, it's the only Eastern Rite church that doesn't have a Orthodox corollary. and that has to do with the history of the Maronites in Lebanon. And then I think it was in Aramaic, the language.
Aramaic.
Yeah,
Wow.
but I think it was the only spoken Aramaic.
The language of
Yeah, the language that
Jesus'
Christ
own
spoke,
language.
yeah.
Wow.
And so then, but our worlds, our lives were in parishes, I mean, and parochial schools in Detroit's Catholic world. And Detroit's Catholic world is a very, anyone who's experienced it, and there's hundreds of thousands of people who have experienced Detroit's Catholic world in grade school and high school. It never leaves you.
There were 80 Catholic high schools, you said, when you were growing up?
Now, in high school, which I think was the peak, was something in Detroit, not even the suburbs, I think it peaked at 65, 70, 80, and now there's 2. And one is the UD Jesuit, which is the only Catholic college preparatory high school in the city of Detroit. And the other Catholic high school is the Cristo Rey School, which is run by the Jesuits, which is not college preparatory, deals with poor people, Detroiters from poor backgrounds.
When you went to UD High, it coincided exactly with the Second Vatican Council.
UD is the University of Detroit. The University of Detroit is a Jesuit university. It's now UD Mercy. And then the high school was the University of Detroit High School, and we were like a mile apart. And the university was built in the 1920s during the boom in Detroit. And it was in a relatively almost suburban area, maybe 2 miles from the Detroit border. And then UD High, which had been downtown, in 1931, I think it was, moved a mile away. And we were in high school a mile from 8 Mile, which is the northern border of Detroit, where Eminem had the movie 8 Mile. Well, that's north of that is the northern suburbs, and then you've got your western suburbs that go toward Ann Arbor, and then you've got your eastern suburbs that go toward Grosse Pointe. And then if you go up, you're along the Lake St. Clair and whatever. It's lake country.
Do you remember
And also a very old part of the North American Jesuits was Detroit. Significant part of the North American Jesuits. The founder of the University of Michigan, one of them, Gabriel Richard, was a Jesuit, and a remarkable man and a very important person in the history of the city of Detroit, and a Jesuit. And so we were very aware at UD High of being part of that. In the chapel, we had the stained glass windows had the North American martyrs in the chapel.
And that was so he was aware of the Jesuit presence in Detroit, the Catholic identity very strong in Detroit, and then, as you mentioned to me, the Second Vatican Council happening at that time, and so much.
Happened during when I was in high school.
Yeah, and you were just aware of that? You were
Sure
following
we were
it?
aware of it. We changed the Mass. We didn't go to Mass every day anymore, and it wasn't in Latin anymore. Suddenly it was in English. The first time that this happened. And we had, and it was, and so there was it started, I think, our sophomore year. I started in '62, and I think it started our sophomore, certainly by our junior year. And so we were there literally during the first changes of the liturgy. And it was also during the civil rights time. And it was also, and we had scholastics who were very active in the civil rights movement. We had scholastics. Scholastics were Jesuits who taught high school in the 7, 8 years. It takes the 6th and 7th year, I think. We had one Jesuit who marched in the South. And they brought that up in Detroit. This is Detroit, 1962 to 1966. Right after I graduated after my freshman year in Michigan was the riots. But this was Detroit. And Detroit's history of class and violence and race. So the Catholicism and the Jesuits and the link to Detroit's history was all very much part of my imagination, fundamental to my imagination. And I use the word fundamental very carefully.
And what about imagination? Were you writing poetry or reading it already in high school?
I didn't write poetry till I was a freshman at Michigan. But I
And why? What started you?
well, I was taking a course in poetry, and the professor taught a poem by Wallace Stevenson called "The Emperor of Ice Cream," and I had gotten pretty much the other poems that he had been teaching, but this one I couldn't figure out. And then he came and he explained it, or at least tried to explain it. No one can quite explain it. And then I said to myself, "This is what I want to do."
Right there.
Yeah, I was 18, my first semester in Michigan. I remember the day, actually. But when James Joyce said that he was the portrait of the artist as a young man, is that to me the accurate perception. You're born a poet. It has nothing to do with background, in my opinion. I think it's almost biological. You're born with this need to express in language this way, which is, then you're into the definition of what poetry is, as opposed to prose, which you spend your whole life trying to figure out. And why? Where does this come from? It has no determination by race, class, gender, whatever. I mean, if you have a social system that discriminates against women or racially and doesn't allow persons to have the freedom to develop this, and political systems always discriminate against people who have this need to do this, but they end up doing it. I mean, because you need to do it. And Joyce saw that. He went back into the childhood, and everything that when he recreates the child's imagination, and then he goes to the Jesuit school, and he recreates the imagination through St. Ignatius, all very consciously. That's probably closer to the experience. I always thought like this. I just didn't realize this is what I was going to do. So it's back then. And that's just the inner imaginative sense that, in the way that it develops. So.
And then you wind up at Cambridge on a fellowship, and when I asked you who you were reading, you came right back with one of these two-word answers so confidently, the writer who you found in Cambridge.
Well, you mean Merton?
I was thinking Milosz.
Well, Miłosz, I had found, we were talking about poets who were Catholic, at least professed to be Catholic, didn't deny it. You know, it's a kind of, if you affirmatively don't deny it, you're at least somewhere with the question. And Miłosz was clearly in that side. But no, I actually came across Miłosz. I went to Europe the first time when I was a junior in college, and there was a series. Penguin had these small paperbacks, and they had anthologies, and then they had individual poets. They had started this series, The Modern European Poets in Translation. It's where they were cheap, and paper, and the paper now, I kept them all. I have almost the entire series of them, and the paper's falling apart and everything. But Miłosz there had been an anthology of Polish poets, and Miłosz was in that. And then I also bought one of the Penguin was Zbigniew Herbert, Polish poet. And those were translated by Miłosz and by Peter Dale Scott, and they were not available in the United States. But I had these when I was a junior in college, and I was taking a writing class at Michigan, and later won a poetry award there. So I was writing poetry very seriously then. And I was just reading everything and just absorbing everything. And then I remember in the introduction to the Zbigniew Herbert that Miłosz didn't write, he talks about him as having a moral consciousness. And I said, there it is, you know, it's because that's the way I was thinking. And so
But that's what you would do in poetry, is have
well,
a
no,
moral
it's a development of, you know, you learn, every poet has a different imagination. I mean, everybody, of course, we wouldn't want it any other way. And so the only thing in common is in my opinion, is you need to do this. You know, you're primarily, when you're making the poem, you're a poet. And you're dealing with all the issues of writing poetry, which are aesthetic issues. In other words, you're in a tradition, you're writing it. I write in the American language, and that's the Ars Poetica. And I put that right up front in the poems. I mean, that's the primary identity. And Stevens later said this, the subject, matter of poetry is poetry first, and then everything with it issues from that. And that's absolutely comports with my sense of it. But everybody has a different imagination, and I think what happens is that you do this constantly, all the time in one part of your brain, which I've been doing since I realized this is what I was going to do. You find your imagination. You find those parts of your imagination that are fundamental to your imagination, and then you end up, or at least I ended up, finding correlatives in other poets. In other words, if I found a poet that was also interested in moral issues and did not deny that he was Catholic, like Miłosz, suddenly that's of great interest to me. And then I see who Miłosz was reading, and then I follow it, and then I read, I study it, and which poets do. You find your imagination. So the Catholic side, if I'm reading a poet and I find out the poet was, I don't look for Catholic poets. I mean, that never was interest of me. But if I found out a poet had a Catholic background, Pasolini, for example.
Then you'd get interested in Pasolini with that as part of what you knew about him.
Every Italian, every Frenchman, every Spaniard, every Latin American.
How is it you were...
William Carlos Williams is a quarter Catholic. And, well, yeah.
And he's got a Jesuit in the American grain, right?
Puerto Rican on one side. Carlos. And so, yes. Was he practicing? Did he profess that he was Catholic? No, but he writes about it in the American grain and writes about Pierre Sebastian Razlas. And then talks about Catholicism as opposed to the Puritanism in the United States, the Protestant Puritanism of the 1920s. And he juxtaposes a religion of sensuality and intimacy.
And this is the one that he identifies with.
Yeah.
As opposed to the Puritan.
He's a poet. The sensuality, Joyce literally took from Ignatius Loyola's imagination. Ignatius Loyola's, in the spiritual exercises are set up that you go through the various parts of Christ's life that are parts of the mysteries and the miracles, which with each sense. So you go through and you hear it, you visualize it, and then you hear everything. And this is the process. Well, it's a really extraordinary way to do a spiritual exercise. That isn't emptying yourself as Buddhist spiritual exercising. This is filling yourself. This is filling yourself with sensuality, which is because the basis of Catholicism is that God becomes human, totally human. And with God is human, God is sensual. And Ignatius understood this. That's the way we go. And Joyce was raised in this. And that's how he writes. And he's still in print, right? No, and when I read Joyce for the first time, it just clicked. It just said, this is exactly right. And then I said, yes, of course it comes from St. Ignatius. Of course it comes from St. Ignatius. And I knew what the spiritual exercises were. And so then I've read the spiritual exercises. I've read his autobiography. I mean, I was educated by the Jesuits, and so I understand that. But I study it too because it fulfills or allows me a kind of range, an imaginative range. It isn't as if St. Ignatius of Loyola isn't an important person in world history. If you talk about the great writers of spiritual exercises in the history of the world, St. Ignatius is one of the leading writers of the spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises are extremely important to the human being. So,
what about that Merton-Camus connection that has come up over the years?
I became obsessed with Albert Camus when I was in Cambridge. and Camus.
Which means just reading his works? And
No, had to do with, it came out of the nonviolent Catholic left, which was part of the nonviolent left, which went then into Martin Luther King Jr. And then I became very attracted to that, especially during the war in Vietnam, and then the violence that existed all through American society, which I then began to see, as many of Merton did, and certainly Daniel Berrigan did, as systemic. In other words, this was part of the American imperial capitalism, and then the unleashing of the war. Just in Merton's lifetime, the amount of people killed, and then Vietnam. And Vietnam was occurring during the time of Vatican II and during the time of the civil violence in the United States and racial violence. And so this was all part of the same thing. So Camus was ultimately nonviolent. He wasn't a pacifist, but he was nonviolent, very close to being a pacifist.
Same with Merton.
Same with
Merton said
Merton.
he would defend his family if attacked directly.
Yes, that's exactly right. And then Merton, I found out, the Merton book that attracted me was Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, which is a diary, basically, extraordinary book. And I knew of the contemplative work, but that he later renounced it, and because but Conjectures of Guilty Bystanders, and he writes about poets in it. He writes about Camus, and then I found out that he later, and this was, Berrigan wrote something in No Bars to Manhood. He called it a Camus glossary. When Merton died, he was obsessed with Camus, and he would have probably written a book on Camus. And he wrote, I think, 7 essays. And these essays were published in small places like Merton would publish. And when I got back from Cambridge, I returned to Detroit and then went to law school in Ann Arbor again. I went back to Ann Arbor. I went to the Detroit Public Library, and I went into the periodical room, what are the index to periodicals, and I would look Merton, 1966. And I'd look at them all, and I'd find these essays, and it was a great library, still is, I'm sure, a great library, the Detroit Public Library, the main library, and they'd bring me down the books, these obscure journals. I'd Xerox them. Yeah, basically. And then these later came out, all of them, in Thomas Merton's literary essays, which came out in the early 80s, which is an extremely important book to me.
You gave it to me, and then it was really important to my work.
Well, it's Merton. Merton's Merton. I mean, the poetry doesn't appeal to me that much, although I've read it. His translations are among the best translations of any American poet, of any wide range of translation. Clement of Alexandria, Cesar Vallejo, Nicanor Parra. I mean, these are real contemporary. And then Merton died. And then Berrigan was important because Berrigan was Jesuit. But Merton had as he did on so many people, he had a very strong effect. And sort of people go into Merton, Catholics anybody goes into Merton and sort of finds something. And that's the range of it. I thought at one point he should be a church father. He was that brilliant.
I've heard that from others too.
Yeah.
Is there, not in any literal way, but hearing you talk makes me want to hear another poem.
All right.
Is there something from the new book or anything that kind of takes the temperature of all the things that you've just been telling us about?
Yeah, there's one that I have a particular fondness for. It's called An Ancient Clarity Overlaid. This is in the So Where Are We? What is thought and felt, believed and dreamed, reflected on, the plot worked out in constant depth. What isn't for the time being written is being worked on. How long will it be, the one long poem? Tacitus's Annals, it's half Virgilian lines, Kafka's name on a report. risk classification and accident prevention in wartime, expansion of a tendentious language, and ancient clarity overlaid. What is said is objectively measured by visual and auditory standards of the street. As of last Wednesday, it said 206,603 dead, estimated 18 million displaced. How will it end? It won't. Vast open-air, mud-soaked camps, toxic water. No one can say cluster bombs aren't real. What of my grandparents' families in Lebanon and Syria? What of my grandfather, dead for all but 4 years of my life, yet I think of him and talk to him in the present tense? The beauty of a scene seen in streetlight. Rain stopped, she takes my arm. Wind, icy, gusting, unpecked slip, sky streaked velvet. The power of beauty, the proof accorded. So much of her beauty alive in me to keep me going to the time it takes to finish. Nuance? I know nuance in her eyes. Having been, will ever be, love in the play of the eyes.
How long will it be, the one long poem?
Well,
You've described all your work as...
well, there are beliefs that I don't totally reject, of that it's all, every poet is part of one long Vatican poem from the time poets started doing this. It's, you're right to laugh at this. This is the kind of thing that poets talk about. Don't tell anybody I let out the secret, okay? You can create problems if, in terms of assessing one's mental health, if you believe that kind of thing. The long poem will be from the first poem to the last poem, and that I write. I get this. I think the first poet of the one long poem was Dante, and who's a very important paradigmatically for any poet, but certainly if you understand Catholicism or if that's part of your imagination, he's crucial. So you start with the first canto and you go to the end, and it's one long poem. I have a line in a poem of mine in The Game Changed and Into It. And it's a long poem, and I can pick up in the middle of it. And I'll read several lines from it. Well, maybe I'll just read up till a certain point. This is the way it starts. The game changed. The phantasmic imperium is set in a chronic state of hypnotic fixity. I have absolutely no idea what the fuck you're talking about, was his reply. And he wasn't laughing either. One of the most repellent human beings I've ever known. His presence a gross and slippery lie, a piece of chemically pure evil. A lawyer, although the type's not exclusive to lawyers. A lot of different minds touch and have touched the blood money in the dummy account in an offshore bank, washed clean, free to be transferred into a hedge fund or a foreign brokerage account, at least $500 billion ending up in the United States with more to come. I believe I told you I'm a lawyer, which has had little or no effect on a certain respect I have for occurrences that suggest laws of necessity. I too am thinking of it as a journey. The journey with conversations, otherwise known as the Divina Commedia, is how Asip Mandelstam characterized Dante's poem. Lebanon? I hear the Maronite patriarch dares the Syrians to kill him. No word from my grandfather's side of the family in the Shuf. There are circles here, to quote the professor of international relations and anthropology. Vietnam, Lebanon, and Iraq. Hanoi, Beirut, and Baghdad. The beggar in Rome is the beggar in Istanbul. The blind beggar is playing saxophone, his legs covered with a zebra-striped blanket, the woman beside him holding an aluminum cup Beside them, out of a shopping bag, the eyes of a small sick dog. I'm no pseudo-aesthete. It's a physical thing, an enthusiasm, a transport. The melancholy is ancient. The intent is to make a large, serious portrait of my time. And I'll go on and finish the poem. The sun on the market near Bowling Green, something red, something purple, bunches of roses and lilacs. A local issue for those of us in the neighborhood. Not to know what it is you're breathing in a week when Black Hawk helicopters resume patrolling the harbor. 2 young men blow themselves up attaching explosives on the back of a cat. An insurgency. Commandos are employed. Capital is manipulated to secure the oil of the Asian republics. I was walking in the 40s when I saw it. A billboard with a background of brilliant blue sky with writing on it in soft-edged, irregularly spaced, airy white letters, already drifting off into the air as if they'd been skywritten. The world really does revolve around you. The taxi driver rushes to reach his family before the camp is closed. There's no way I will leave. There is no way. They will have to kill us. And even if they kill every one of us, we won't leave. Sweat dripping from her brow, she picks up the shattered, charred bones. She works for the Commission on Missing Persons. First they kill them, she says, then they burn them, then they cover them with dead babies. Neither impenetrable opacity nor absolute transparency. I know what I'm after. The entire poem is finished in my head. No, I mean the entire poem. The color, the graphic parts, the placement of solid bodies in space, gradations of light and dark, the arrangements of pictorial elements on a single plane without a loss of depth. This habit of wishing, as if one's mother and father lay in one's heart and wished as they had always wished. That voice, one of the great voices, worth listening to. A continuity in which everything is transition. To repeat it because it's worth repeating. Immanence, an immanence and a happiness. Yes, exquisite, an exquisite dream. The mind on fire, possessed by what is desired. The game changed. And there's the mind on fire again. I repeat it. I repeat motifs. A journey of conversations. It was Taras Mandelstam, the great Russian poet.
That was his characterization
He wrote
of
a whole
Dante.
book on Dante.
Journey with Conversations.
Well, he said a lot of things about Dante, and yes, a journey of conversations. And so you start the journey of conversations, and the journey of conversations starts with the first poem and goes all the way through. And then you leave it. Our individual poems they're just conversations, their thoughts, their feelings felt, their expression, and in the form of poetry.
And in part with yourself, there's that line, who talks this way? I talk this way.
Yeah, that's in the, so where are we? Who talks like that? Yeah, I start the poem with this kind of strange language, and then I say, who talks like that? Because it's the same thing of what the, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. In other words, if you move into the realm of poetic language and the language of poetry and the reality of poetry and what poetry does, when every poet has his or her imaginative reality that it pushes up against the world. And so all poetry is really a poetry of witness in the sense of stating and declaring this form of language. If you're Catholic, or since we don't know what that quite means, and no Catholic knows what it quite means, but if you have if your imagination has a fundamental kind of as a foundation in Catholicism, your sense of the world is very much affected by that. And
so what you witness or how you witness it is partly shaped by the things you were telling us at the beginning of the
Yeah.
hour, what you saw as a child,
Yeah.
what you believe,
It's a la- it's a-
the
it's a-
notion
it's
of
a-
Ignatius, and
it's a
and the
faith.
central life.
It's a faith. It's a faith of language. It's the Word made flesh. It's the God who becomes totally human speaks.
But how do you decide? And this is the how is the sausage made question. But there's all that speech out there. There's so many different registers and voices, and heard forms of discourse. And how is it that they cluster together? Or
That's the act of making the poem. That's the art. That's the hardest part, and that's the most important thing. You have to form it, and just as a theologian has to form the thought of theology, Thomas Aquinas formed the thought of theology, and then said at the end that none of it, certainly didn't equal the absolute sense of God, but he did a very strong, and he also wrote in benediction. Let me know if this is okay. This is in benediction, the Tantum Ergo, the little Latin part of the benediction. He wrote those. Those were the greatest poems of Latin in medieval poems were written by Thomas Aquinas, and they're beautiful poems. And so he was a poet. Hans von Balthasar talks about the form of the church, and it's an aesthetic sense. In other words, the importance of forming. But that's what poets do. So I have my field of imagination. It includes all sorts of things: experience, what I read, what I inherit, all the kind of poetics, and then I make them. Poets make language. They make and form language.
I want to have some questions from the audience, but can you read one more poem first?
I think I'll keep it short. It's a poem. It's the second or the third from the last poem in So Where Are We? It's called And For the Record. Revelations reoccurring, he who is babbling away in James Madison Plaza, and what goes around, what comes around, light made holy by the fury of the tears with which it mingles, simple enough when looked at directly, the child, shy and fearful, who won't speak. And for the record, the mind, like the night, has 1,000 eyes, sparrows in the bushes, a small cat rolls in the snow, sleet pounding the windows. In the space of a memory, the facade of a church, an angel on each side of a fiery wheel.
Hearing you read and hearing you speak, I'm beguiled and persuaded, and also frightened to think of the prospect that your future poets won't have the familiarity with the forms of the church that you had from childhood. I know you say the poet is born, the poet, you're going to be a poet regardless, and yet it's so apparent to me how much that those forms meant to you and still mean to you that I hope, however it goes forward, that it goes forward so that a next generation of poets has the familiarity that's just so clear.
There will be poets who have liturgical imaginations, and so they'll express that side of it. In terms of the sort of deeper type of liturgies that exist in Catholicism, I suspect they'll continue. I suspect that and they'll continue in the way that they'll continue.
Someone in the Georgetown community, hearing you were coming, said, "What I want to know about Joseph is where's the hope?" But you've just stated it.
No,
I mean, you're more hopeful than I am.
No,
evidently.
I'm often. We're in a time now, and we've been in a time for a while, but really quite manifest now, where it's become a real manifest cultural reality of the problem of despair and hope. I see hope very much as it's one of the theological virtues. And the theological virtues are three, and St. Augustine in De Trinitate, his great treatise on the Trinity, talks of the triune God but in threes, and one of the threes is faith, hope, and love, which are the same and different. So, if you're having trouble with hope, just focus on what you believe in, because that's what you believe in, something that you're hoping for. If you focus
and
on
this
love.
is why I've been in conversation with you for 24 years,
Yeah,
because
well, that's, but I get that. I get that from theology. That's where I get that from, and I get it from Catholic theology, and so that's what's in the poems. The other thing, and it's very true, even if you don't have that, the very act of making an object of feeling and beauty, that which artists give us, and the painters and the musicians and the fiction writers and that part of the species, the very assertion of it, especially in difficult times, when you have killers and you have people who want to destroy beauty and destroy love, and it's now global and it's intricately involved in our ecosystems. Those are very, very strong acts of hope, faith, hope, and love operating.
the making of art.
The making of anything, yes, the making of art, but also even beyond that, and I think this is what art gives us, is we see that in what the artist does, and then it helps us live, because it helps form for us what we're feeling at some level, and then it makes us more human, and then fiercely human. In other words, you'll die to protect the species. You'll die for who you love, and to protect beauty and goodness and all and truth. And so that has been it's strongly human.
Wow. Questions or comments from others here? Yes.
I'm curious as to how your poetic side, your study, thank you. I'm curious as to how your study of poetry and your writing of poetry has informed your study of law and your writing of law.
They're clearly part. Wallace Stevens was a lawyer and a very important poet, and a really great poet, and at this point probably acknowledged more as a great poet than any other American poet, although there are other great poets. He said that he had the same mind. I mean, but he said he put them in compartments. If I'm in the world of law, and it depends on what I'm doing, and so I focus on that and that language and that type of issues. Does my imagination as a lawyer help me in imagining, or as a poet help me in imagining stuff as a lawyer? Yeah, I mean, it's the same mind. There are lawyers that have imaginations, and they're not the imagination of a poet, but they're very imaginative and very good. So there's an overlap there. The other thing that's come over years, I know the language of law, and the language I know well. I've done it my years, I mean, and I've taught it, and I've practiced it, and I've written in it, and so I know it. And the language of law virtually in America encompasses all of social reality, and it's rhetorical, and it's necessary. There's no law without language. Law is a language system, but it's also a political system. So it's this language of power. And I've been able to take that language and use that language in my poetry, in the way that I construct the poems. I think it's been of great value to me to write about political power, and to use those kind of rhetorical structures. And that's entirely, it's become part of the way that I think and I write, and there I see no precedent. In other words, I've tried to see others who have done this, and this is something that I think I've patch together my own way because of my just experience in these different languages. You know, in the legal world, my legal career, people know that I'm a poet, but I don't bring it into the classroom. You know, I don't tell my students, you know, talk to them about poets and stuff. I'm there to teach them, you know, when I'm teaching them. They're going to be lawyers, and I'm teaching them law and everything that goes with it and the practice of it, including its political importance. So I think that's the link of it.
Are there any strands of the Lebanese, Syrian cultural, spiritual tradition that have influenced you and your poetry? And are there any Eastern Orthodox spiritual writers that have influenced you?
In the larger sense, in terms of the poetry, I'm aware of Arab writers and contemporary Arab writers and the translations. Yeah, I think that the side of it is the Arab writing, just in terms of tradition, is highly politically charged. And also highly spiritually charged, if you like, and so yes, I think I have that in my imagination, and I think and I write about this. I mean, it's part of it, and I always root it in my background because it was very strong when I was a child. My grandparents were immigrants, and we were very close. It's a very close family, an extended family, as Lebanese and Syrians are, and especially if you're Catholic. And the Eastern side's interesting. It's a really good question. The theologians, I like Orthodox theologians, and there's the kind of way that metaphor works and iconography works with the Eastern Orthodox mind, or the Melkite mind, is something that I think I don't overly determine. It's not doesn't determine anything, but I think my metaphorical imagination comes out of or part of it comes out of the Eastern side, also. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking about Isaac the Syrian and Ephraim the Syrian, their spiritual poetry.
Yeah, and they're also dealing with the world. I mean, there's no shyness in writers in the Arab world or dealing with what's going on in the world. It's fairly strong in Orthodox churches. The Russian Orthodox Church is very linked to Russia as a political, and that's true of Eastern Orthodoxy. The Catholicism is a little, you know, these are histories. I'm Roman Catholic, and but sometimes there's, you know, I ask myself what makes me different from somebody who would be Orthodox, and it's not, an immediate answer doesn't come up if I were to pursue that.
So you're 35 years old, you come home from wherever you're living. How does your mother introduce you? My son the poet, my son the attorney.
I don't think my mother would have entered into my mother's mind to introduce me one way or the other, and they were very proud of me, but they weren't, you know, they were. My mother was very moved by the fact that I was a poet, and which moved me, but she was very moved by it. And my father, although I write about my father and my mother and my uncle, and sometimes, you know, the harshness of their lives, and they had no problem with it. and I think it was because because the poems gave shape and witness to their own particular lives. And these are people that didn't expect that and didn't ask for that. And they led their lives and, protected their families. And so there wasn't this side like, this kind of bravado or anything like that.
I was gonna say that when you read your poems, there was a rapper named Tupac once said that a rose can grow from concrete. So, with people saying how sometimes your poems can lack hope or other things, do you think you could say that maybe beauty can come from a dark place?
I'm sorry, the lead.
That beauty. When you talked about beauty and love, do you think that you could say with your poems that beauty can come from a dark place?
Yes, I think that's part of it. And I've dealt with that. I mean, the question, Flannery O'Connor was obsessed with that. She was obsessed with, she believed in original sin, and she believed in evil in the world, and wrote about it. And so the aesthetic question becomes is if you're dealing with this and you also believe in light and you believe in goodness, how do you deal with that in terms of your question? So part of this would be, I think one of the ways to do it is to clarify it and to see it very clearly, and then to set it up as an issue. And again, sometimes even from the beginning, to get a little defensive if people say, where's the happiness in your poems or whatever, and just, they can put it into the poem. Look at, like I say in the poem I read, nuance, I know nuance. Don't, I know what happiness is. Just because I don't, wear it on my sleeve or something like that, or I'm doing different things, because the objective in a poem is very different than, the poem is not, it's part of life, but it's not life. It's not life itself, goes in all sorts of different directions. The question of despair is not, is human. The question of sorrow, every human being is sorrowful. Why wouldn't you be sorrowful? And what we experience, the experience of love is actually more limited. Not everybody has the gift of it. And again, love and hope and faith are the same as far as, and you can do that circular type of reasoning. I believe in what I hope for example. Yeah, so that's what you believe. So if I hope for what I believe, you can just turn that. That's
in Augustine's way.
That's Augustine.
These things
that's
are
Augustine.
all
That's the
different aspects of the same
triune
reality.
thinking. Memory, understanding, and will are the same. He does it book after book. A very, very important person in the history of the world, Augustine of Hippo.
No question there. Larry, thank you so much. Thank
you,
you for the poetry, for the insights, and for your friendship over the years, and just for being here at Georgetown. Thanks to the Berkley Center, to the Office of Campus Ministry, and the Office of the President, who are all in their different ways sponsored this event, and they're all your hosts. Let's go into the other room, and you'll sign some books and see some people and carry the conversation farther.
To be continued.
Indeed. Thank you.